So I'm going to need some sort of term to refer to blocks that have been put into the matched state due to the presence of a special block near them. I think the term I'm going to use is linked. Linked because it implies that there's a connection between them, and it's a different word than matched or adjacent or neighbor. Basically, I'm using the word linked because it's going to create like a chain of all these different blocks that are going to be matched. So I'm going to make a new variable on every block called b is linked to SpecialBlock. And that implies, if this is true, that this block has been touched. I was considering the word touched, but touched is not quite right either. I think linked might be a more accurate description of what's going on. So if a block has been linked to the special block, then it becomes matched, and it has a unique status where even if it's not matched with adjacent blocks, it's going to become matched and stay matched until blocks fall underneath it, and then the special block will check again to see if there are new blocks that need to be linked again. So it's going to be a bit of a complex process of figuring out what we need to change and where we need to change it, if we need to change things, or if we can just add things in. But it might break old things if we just add them in without considering things like rechecking, when we need to recheck all the linked blocks. Say there was a situation where a block was linked but not matched in the normal way, but it was only linked, and then the blocks underneath that one fall. We have to check again if that block is now still linked. So basically every time any blocks fall, every special block in play needs to recheck its links, but we'll get to those finer details after we've got the basics down. So when a special block is placed, it's going to run a check that is going to kind of be recursive. So we'll make a new function called check adjacent blocks for linking. That's a pretty bad name, but we'll see if we can come up with a better name after we actually write the function and see what it's actually going to do. Maybe we can refine the name later. So what this function is going to do is check directly up, directly right, down, and left of our current block to see if they are blocks that match our color. And if they are, we're going to turn them linked. So turn this boolean on that object to true. And then we're going to have that object, this block above or to the right of us, run this function again, so that that block will then check above, to the right, left, and down, and see if any of those blocks are the same color. And if so, then do the same thing on that block. So it's going to cascade, or perpetuate through every block until we find a point where this block doesn't have any neighbors that are the same color as it, and then that branch will terminate, and then we'll go back up a level, and that one will terminate. And so eventually the recursive base case is that none of our neighbors are unlinked same color blocks, and then we'll stop calling this function again. Eventually all the calls will return and we'll continue on with the game. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully it's going to work. We'll see. So when we place down the player's quad, so it's finish falling where this happens in the player controller. When the player controller calls the finish falling function, and we're about to spawn in some new quads and check for matches on all blocks. Before we do all this stuff, we need to look at our 4 blocks in our quad and see if any of them are a special block. And if they are, then we need to run this check for whatever I called it, check adjacent blocks for linking on that block. So I'll make it doesn't really need to be a self-contained function, but I will make a comment block here. Check our 4 blocks. If any of them are special blocks, then run the recursive linking function on them. On it, so I'll say if one of them is a special block, then run the recursive linking function on it. So we're just going to get our 4 get quad elements. We already have this function to get all 4 quad elements easily, so we'll just use get quad elements, and for each of the 4 quad elements, if we are special, then we run check adjacent blocks for linking on ourselves. So this will work if there's multiple special blocks inside of the quad, which there shouldn't be, but just in case there is, it'll find all 4 of them. And so here we're going to look above, to the right, down, and to the left. We already have some of that logic when we do determine matches. We're doing a for each loop on the offsets array. So we can do something similar, but make a new offsets array that has 4 elements instead of 8 elements. So I will copy this logic and change it slightly. So we need to make a new offsets array local variable. I'll call it adjacent offsets array. An array of vectors which contains the offsets that will give us the end locations for the traces that will find our 4 cardinal direction neighbors. Pretty roundabout way of saying that, but hopefully that would make sense if you come back to this project a year later. So this will be the adjacent offsets array here, and we'll need to make our own object types again, which is just object type query. Set our own here, and we will copy the determine matches collapsed graph here, which instead of getting 8 offsets, we only need 4 of them. We only need directly up, directly right, directly down, and directly left. So this will be simpler. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. So copy this into this function. I'll make it a collapsed graph. call it make adjacent offsets array. Because we collapsed this while it had the execution pins flowing through it, it automatically put these exec pins here. So we need to do that ourselves here since I copied it in a different way. When I go to here, these don't have any input or output pins. So if I just type exec here and copy what it automatically put here, execute, and a new exec pin here called then. Now I just need to change this so that there's only 4 of these and they're just directly up, directly right, directly down, and directly left. There we go, hopefully that makes sense, and I just need to move these so that there's only 4 elements. And instead of setting offsets array, we're setting adjacent offsets array. And now that should compile, unless I forgot something. If I go back to the top here, we can hook this up. And now what we're doing is just tracing, doing line traces in the 4 directions, up, right, down, left, and getting the blocks at each of those locations. And what we need to check for is if they're the same color as us, and we also need to, well, we'll go ahead and make array of comparison results, but we might do that a little differently. We're not actually making an array like this, so we might not need this, but we need to check to make sure it's the same color as us, and, so and Boolean, that it is not linked to SpecialBlock. So the reason we want to say not linked to SpecialBlock is we don't want to end up having an infinite loop where we check the block to our right, and then that block checks to its left, and then that block checks to its right, and then just check back and forth on each other and execute the same function on each other over and over again. So when they start executing this function, every block needs to set this variable to true, or in fact it'll already be set true by its neighbor. So I guess we can set it in this function, but we'll pick one or the other. I think we'll set it inside here. So we'll set this to true on ourselves, and then we will make sure that the neighbor that we're checking doesn't have that set to true to prevent infinite loops of recurring back and forth among 2 objects over and over again. So if both of these conditions are met, then we're going to run this function on our target. And running this function will prevent the infinite loop, because as soon as this function runs, the target is going to get this value set to true on itself as it's running this function, which will prevent infinite loops, I think. So we'll see if that is true or not. And if false, we're just not going to do anything. And this loop will terminate eventually because there's only 4 things to check. And it's either going to run this function and recur a level deeper, or it's going to not do anything and eventually return from all 4 of these checks. So eventually we'll hit this return node on every block that this got called on. And so I don't think there's going to be an infinite loop, but we'll see. I don't know why I had that error just now. I think it's just some weirdness with collapsed graphs in the order that I put things in. It was thinking this didn't exist when it just wasn't getting updated properly. So I just had to replace my references, and now it seems to be working. I think it'll be helpful to have a way to visually distinguish between a block that has been matched due to an actual quad matching and blocks that have been matched due to the special blocks linking them. So I don't want to make yet another material instance and have a whole other set of things that need to change and be accounted for with both colors. So I think a possible solution is to have a UI overlay on every single block that simply creates like a green box, a thin line, a green square encapsulating the block on screen that is matched via a linking block. So that'll be clear to the player that all the blocks that have that line around them were linked just now, and they'll be cleared, and it's going to be a new way of telling that it's a distinct mechanism that caused the matching. So to do that, I'll just make a new function called become linked, and this will be called inside of this method. So here we'll call become linked, and this is going to obviously set our linked boolean, and it's also going to make component or add component. So we're going to add a widget component to the actor. And the relative transform is going to be 0, so just a basic transform. So it'll be at the same location as the actor, same rotation, same scale. Because we want this widget to be centered on the actor. And then we're going to set widget here to a new type that we're going to create right now. And then we'll simply return. And this widget is just going to be, for now, a really simple green square that will be a certain size. And that's going to be the tricky sticking point here, is if we can get the size to be correct regardless of the window size that the game is playing in. And that could be a tricky issue, but we'll see if we can figure it out. So I'm just going to call this UI underscore linked block box. So it's just simply going to be a box that is, I can probably reuse the box I'm using for the next box, so I don't have to make a new image. So I'm just going to add an image to the canvas, put it at the center of the widget, exactly centered, 0.5, 0.5. And I'm going to add the rounded rectangle. So this image will be what we're going to use for now, I suppose. Now the size is going to be tricky, but we'll start with this and see what we need to adjust it to. I'm going to change the color of the image to green, and maybe We might need to make it like thicker, but we'll see. And we can make this fade in and fade out too, so it looks a little more nuanced, but I just kind of want to see what this does, if anything. And this will make it easier to debug the current function we have before we add the matching functionality, which is going to have its own share of quirks. Like, how do we adjust the score for a match caused by linking as opposed to caused by a quad? But we'll get into that in a bit. For now, I want to see if this even does anything, or if it crashes the entire project, which is possible. So instead of doing set widget here, I think I can do it inside of this node by just selecting screen here, and then the UI linked block box. And then this draw size, we might be able to set that based on certain parameters to make it scale with the window size. But I think right now they're going to be way too big, is my hunch. But I don't even know if our logic for running this function is working at all, so we'll see. Okay, we have a box here. I don't know if it would work if there were more blocks here. It seems to just be appearing around the gem blocks, whether or not they're matched, so that's an issue. And they're approximately 3 times too big, so we need to shrink them down. Okay, so that draw size isn't factoring in. It's actually this size. 2/3 of this is 83. No, come on, brain. It's 66 again. So 66.6. Repeating, of course. And we'll see what that looks like now. Okay, it's too small, but it's there. We just need to make it thicker. So I've made a new texture in paint.net, which is just very similar to this rounded rectangle, but thicker so that it is more visible on screen, hopefully. So we'll use that image instead of this one. And we'll see what that looks like on screen now. Okay, so that's something. I just need to make it actually propagate to the other ones that are its other neighbors when it lands. So let's see why we're not propagating properly. Let's see if we're actually getting blocks here. So I'll just print the display name of every block that we find when we do our checks to see if we're actually finding any. And I didn't get any printouts, so I guess we're not calling the function like we thought we were. So right here I'm just going to get the length of this array and see if it's of length 4. Okay, it is of length 4, and we are running this function, but let's see why we're not getting anything valid out of this. Also, we might want to just do a multi-line trace for objects instead of just a normal line trace. That might solve it right away. So here we need to do a for each loop, and then on each element we get the actor, like so. Still not returning anything. So now we'll print out the 4 vectors in our array to see if they're the values we expect them to be. They are, in fact, the right values. We are getting a warning about invalid object types. Oh, you know what? That's probably because I forgot one small but important thing. Here on the object types array, this is empty. So I need to make that world dynamic. That's why I wasn't finding anything, because I wasn't checking for anything. So we know this array is right. So to avoid some debugging issues, make sure you set world dynamic here on our one array element. If you leave that blank, we won't find anything when we do our scan. So I can maybe revert this to a single line trace, but for now we'll keep it multi. So now when our special block lands, let's see what happens. Okay, I'm seeing each block twice here in the checks, so perhaps I can go back to a single line trace here. Oh, you know, the reason why it was showing each one twice is because I had 2 print statements. That's why. Oops. But I'll leave it as a single line trace because that's what we're doing for normal determined matches. So it should work fine for this too. And in fact, it seems to have correctly highlighted all the blocks as I would have wanted it to. So this does seem to be working, at least for the highlighting purposes. And for drawing these boxes, rather. And these boxes do get removed when the owners get destroyed, which is good. So now we just need to do a bit more logic there. First I'm going to remove some of these debug lines that I've had for a long time on the clearing. When the game mode does this function and scans the row for blocks, I need to turn this off so that those lines aren't there every time. That's been there for a while. It's kind of annoying, but now they're out of the picture. And now when we become linked, we want to become matched too. This is where we have to make a decision about how the scoring is going to be affected by this. Do we want every block that becomes linked to give like extra points? I suppose it wouldn't hurt too much to do that. So when we run our check for matches on a single block, so we determine matches on the block, that's here on the block. So here when we determine matches, this stuff here, we start from scratch, we count up all our matches we're a part of, and we make that our return value. And this ensures that the matches stay accurate even after we drop and update our location. So if we want the linked aspect to translate to an extra match, that way there'll be at least one match, which means a block will enter the match state here. Even if it's not a part of a quad like this, this is for all the 4 quads it could possibly be a part of. But if we make another sequence node here that just says if B is linked to SpecialBlock is true, then increment num matches, then we could be part of up to 5 matches if we're surrounded on all sides by a quad. So we're a center of a 3x3 square of the same color, and we are linked, then we'll be part of 5 quads total, or 5 matches total. So that's going to just increase the general points you get for having special blocks, but it'll also make our logic work properly. So all we need to do is say if we're linked to a special block, then branch. If that's true, then just do this. So it's just another way of getting matched that doesn't involve being part of a quad. And this should make them become matched. And we need a way to break the link, so that's important. Otherwise we'll have blocks that stay highlighted and matched even when the linked block gets separated from them, which could happen if, say, the timer bar sweeps through an area and highlights some blocks, and then these blocks come down, then a special gem comes down and makes some new matches, but the highlighted ones underneath them get destroyed, and then the special gem gets separated from its prior linked neighbors, and those become unlinked. So we need to unlink things, and that way this will get updated, and then when this function runs again to determine matches after, you know, some falling has occurred, they'll become properly unlinked, and this will no longer induce a match, which will allow the block to become unmatched again here. So this all should work out. We just need a way to scan the entire game for special blocks and then run the become linked function. Okay, so I think what we can do is change the way we're calling check adjacent blocks for linking. Instead of calling it directly on the blocks in our quad, we want to, like, instead of doing this, we probably want to just do a game-wide scan for all blocks, every single block in play that's valid, and unlink them automatically, and then check for special blocks that are placed, and run the check adjacent blocks for linking on all of those, because that way blocks are only linked when they're proven to still be linked, right? Then they'll become unlinked unless they are still linked. That'll just make it a little bit simpler to keep track of whether it's still linked. I'm trying to think of any potential drawbacks to doing it that way. If we want to do an animation for when the block initially becomes linked, and so the green box kind of fades in instead of appearing suddenly, then that fade in animation, that will play multiple times during play when it shouldn't, unless we introduce another boolean to make sure that only happens once. We could do it like that. We can, when we have the become linked function, we'll have a check so that we don't spawn in multiple widgets on a block. So what I'm talking about is the block has the become linked function, and instead of spawning in the widget like this, I'll make a variable which is a linked box widget reference. We'll see if this works. So a reference to a widget component, which isn't initially attached to the object, but it's still just a reference here. And if this is not null, that means we spawned it in already, so we can just set it to true, set visibility to true. But if it's null, then we need to create it. So then we will add widget component to our actor with the default transform, just like before. And set the value of this variable to this reference. So then next time we call this function, that's what we're checking here. So this will return false the first time we run this function, which will allow us to run an initialize animation when this widget component gets created the first time. and then subsequent times it'll just immediately be set visible. This will allow us to change the way we're calling the check adjacent blocks for linking function to do it on every block at once, while keeping the smooth animations that we want to add for the boxes. So first, let's see if this works. It should. There's no distinction between the first time and second time visually here in the game, but it should at least work as it did before. But it's not even showing any boxes anymore, so let's see. I need to change this to actually be the box. And we'll just do a print statement. Well, no, there's no need to check. We're never going to call it a second time yet. Okay, cool. Now, when we become unlinked, which will make that function right now, which is going to happen every time the drop all blocks to fill gaps function is called. Then we're going to unlink every single linked block. So we just set this to false. And then we just hide our object with this reference. Just do a isValid just in case. Which it should always be valid if this is called, because we would have become linked the first time. So there's no realistic situation I can think of where this would not be valid, but I'm just going to check it to be safe. We're just going to set this to set the visibility here to false. We might make a fade out animation later for the box so that it smoothly fades in and out, but for now I'm just going to set the visibility to false here to test it out, and then return. But the widget is still valid and still on the actor, so the next time become linked is called, we won't create another one. We're just going to turn the first one visible again. So now in the player controller, instead of doing this, we're going to make a function in the game mode that is just called unlink all linked blocks. And the reason why we want to unlink all blocks is so that when we recheck every block for matches, blocks that have fallen and become separated from their gem are no longer considered linked, and they only will be linked if they're still connected to the gem. So we're going to unlink all linked blocks, so we just need to do get all actors of class block pp, and then for each block, if it is valid, if it is also linked, then we call become unlinked on it. And then we just return. And this will be part of the two-step process of now checking all linked blocks, or sorry, all blocks for special blocks, and then running the function on those. So maybe right now, maybe I'll call this unlink all linked blocks and recheck links, which I know it's bad to have a function do like multiple things at once, but it really is just doing one simple thing of updating all the links to make sure they're still valid and removing ones that are no longer valid. But it's doing that by first removing all links and then re-linking the ones that are still linked. So I'm going to make an array, a local array here, called all special blocks. And this is the blocks that actually have the gems, not just linked blocks, but blocks that have gems that are currently in play and not part of the player quad. So if we found a valid block and it's linked, then have it become unlinked. But whether it's linked or not, we want to check and see, is it a special block? And is it part of the quad? So if it's not part of the quad and it is a special block, so if this block is not part of the player's quad and is a special block, then we want to add it to this array of all special blocks. So first let's make this an array and then add this element to it. Add this array element, which is the special block we're currently looking at, to the array of all special blocks. And the reason we want this array is so we can run the link checks again on all blocks as soon as we unlink everything. And we're just saving time by only cycling through all the objects once. So we don't have to call this again on all blocks and then check to see if they're special blocks. We're just going to cache all the special blocks right now and then use them immediately afterwards. So if they are not a special block, continue on to this check and then do this. Okay. And now as soon as this loop is completed, then we're going to do a for each loop on all special blocks. And run check adjacent blocks for linking. And then return upon completion of that. And now this should allow us to change what we're doing in the player controller. Instead of doing this, we should be able to delete all of that. And we have to be careful about the order in which we call things here. But we want to update the player quad first. And then, here's where we update the player quad. And then we want to do this unlink all and relink. So I have a bunch of game mode references here, but I'm gonna just remove these and do one, so I just don't have 3 nodes here for no reason. So I could simplify this by having a wrapper function in the game mode that says like on player finish falling, and then it just runs these 3 functions in succession. That's a bit better for encapsulation purposes, but not a big deal for now. So the game mode runs these 3 things. First, it updates the player quad and gets the new one ready, and then we unlink all linked blocks and get all the special blocks and rerun the link check, not including the player quad, because the player quad could now have a new special block that hasn't been placed yet. So we make sure it's only the placed blocks. And then once the linking status has been updated, then we check for matches on all blocks, which will run determined matches, which relies on the links being up to date. So this is the correct order, I think, to do all these things. And now we'll see if it doesn't crash and burn. Okay, seems to be working so far. There's only one test. And it's relinking things as it should right there. So it updates the links when new ones come in, which is important. But there's too many gem blocks right now to accurately test if it's, linking things properly. But so far it looks like it is. Yeah, it seems to be working properly. So that's very cool. And the blocks are becoming matched when they should. Let's confirm that that's true by making a series of blocks. Okay, yeah, here's the problem right there, right? These didn't become unlinked. They might become unlinked when the player falls down right here. Let's see if they do. If I drop really quickly, then they became unlinked, which is good. But we want that to happen not just when the player finishes falling, but whenever the blocks finish falling. So, well, we do want this here because we want to run the link as soon as the player drops their new special block off. But we also want to run this whenever the timer bar clears highlighted blocks and then the blocks drop underneath. Because what happened for the bug just now was that the timer bar cleared one of the gems, but then the blocks that were linked remained, and we never ran the update until the player dropped their quad. So we need to make sure when the timer bar, let's go to the timer bar. When the timer bar clears highlighted blocks and then drops blocks to fill gaps in this function, as soon as we run drop all blocks to fill gaps, here we check for matches again, right? So just as we check for matches in the game mode here, in the player controller, just as we check for matches right here, we need to precede that with this unlink all linked blocks and recheck links. So these kind of go together. So I should probably just tie them together so that I always call them together. But again, that's a encapsulation and reusability thing to consider for sure. So if I was planning to expand this and turn it into a production quality game, I would probably refactor this and put them together. And then I'd also probably do event dispatchers so that this was not just called from another function like this, called from another object. I would have an event saying, just finished falling, and then this game mode would pick up on that and say, okay, if the player just finished falling, I need to do this, this, and that. But for now, I'm just going to copy this over to where it needs to go, which is right here. Also, for testing purposes, I'm going to decrease the likelihood of gems appearing. So that's not 100% of the time, but maybe 25% of the time. So instead of 0, I'll have a 4 here, which should then have a 25% chance of being 0, because it's numbers between 0 and 3 inclusive. So 1 in 4 chance of a gem appearing on any particular preview quad after the first 3. So I'm going to set up this sequence of orange blocks here where there's no matches yet, but it's a chain of blocks, and I just need to get an orange special gem, which could take some time. So in the meantime, I'll test these ones over here. Okay, an orange one's coming up, so now it should, all these orange ones should become highlighted. Yep. Cool, cool. So I'm gonna probably try to make that green box a little bit transparent slightly so that it's not so distracting. It's not that it's distracting, but it might be a little bit too prominent. So if I make the opacity of this image like 0.7, see what that looks like, or 0.4, 0.6, we'll see. It'll look different in game, so we'll need to test it out in game. But I'm also going to make some animations. So fade in is just going to simply fade in the image. From 0 to, I guess, 0.6. We'll have it initially be 0 then. So the render opacity outside of the animation will make this 0. And then when it plays the animation, it'll come in. And then when it gets broken, we want it to fade out. So I guess I'll do the same thing, or just play it in reverse. So I will make an event here called box fade in and box fade out, and they'll just play the fade in animation forwards or backwards. So play animation. Oops. So play animation, and this one will just play the animation in reverse. So to play these animations, let's go to the place where we become linked and unlinked in the block. When we first create this thing, we want to... The reason why I initially made it like this was because I wanted it to fade in the first time, but then when we clear them all and then when we become unlinked on all blocks and then become linked again here, I wanted to make sure it didn't play the animation over and over again every time we ran the check all blocks for links update function. So we'll see how this goes, but when I first create it, I will try to play the animation on it. So we need to get user widget object and then cast this to the linked block box. And then play the fade in. And then here, I don't think I need to set visibility. I could probably just not do anything, because I'm not going to set it invisible. I'm going to do the fade out animation instead. So when we become unlinked, it's possible that I could play the animation here instead of setting the visibility to false. And if we start playing the fade out animation and then immediately, like on the same frame or 1 or 2 frames later, set the other animation to play, it's going to do this weird thing that we don't want. I think we'll see that if I change this right now. So I'll just pull this out, and instead it'd probably be good to cache this reference, or cache this casted type. So like instead of having this reference, actually save the reference of the casted type. But for now I'll just do this, because we're just going to do a bunch of casting if we don't save the reference. But I want to fade out here and see what it looks like if I do this, but I'm a bit worried it's going to do this weird ping pong thing that we don't want. Okay, so the fade in is fine, and I didn't get a chance to test out the fade out because it cleared him before I thought to check. So let's get another gem. See, it's going to play the fade out animation even when it shouldn't have, because of the way it's set up right now. Yeah, it just is all wacky. So let's see. Maybe we will only play the fade in animation the first time. It could seem a bit arbitrary to the player if they notice the animation happens the first time but not on future times, but we'll see how it looks. I'm going to speed up the fade in too, so I'll play that at twice speed. It might be barely noticeable at that point, in which case why even bother with animations at all. But let's see when we play the become linked. So here we just turn the visibility off and then we'll turn it back on here. Test out the breaking of the links to see if the animation works okay. I need to set up a long chain and then drop the gem on the right hand side of the timer bar. Like that. Okay. So it became unlinked, and now if this block becomes linked again, I want to see what happens with the animation. The fade in animation should be different for that block specifically, because it won't fade in, it'll just suddenly be colorful again. It'll suddenly be solid green again. Let's see. Or it just doesn't work. If it was, yeah, I don't know. That was weird. Something bad happened there, I think, where blocks should have been turned green, but they weren't. So we can add in new blocks like this. And if we do that, then we have a bit of an issue. So these blocks that just were highlighted and they became unmatched, it was the right gameplay behavior, but they didn't get linked, I don't think, when they should have. Like, they should have had the green boxes around them for a moment, but they didn't. So there could be something about the order in which I'm checking to make sure things are linked or not, but I'll do a bit more experimenting and see if I notice any major issues. So I haven't noticed anything majorly problematic with the link boxes. If there is something that's wrong, it might only be cosmetic. I don't think it's leading to any gameplay bugs where like something doesn't work when it should. like you shouldn't have gotten a match and you did, or you should have gotten a match and you didn't, or you should have gotten a match and you did. So if there's anything weird with the link boxes, I think it's only a visual bug, not something that's going to lead to the wrong gameplay outcome. So I think this is good. Oh, one thing I haven't checked is, does the score that we see in these green boxes always correspond with the right score that we... Oh, that could be something I've overlooked. The way we calculate the score is by dividing an integer by 4 and then using that value as the number of quads we've matched, which determines the score that we get. But when you add an extra match to the pool by using the linking match, you'll get 5, and you try to divide 5 by 4, and you get 1. So it doesn't count the link as an extra quad. I don't know. There's something with the scoring that might not be accurate. So we may run into cases where the points that show up when you clear a series of blocks like this doesn't match what the points actually are or should be based on what the linking does. But I never claimed that we were going to get 100% accurate scoring functionality, so hopefully that's okay if it's a little bit ambiguous. But we do have all the major gameplay functionality working, including the special blocks, which I initially wasn't planning to do, but I figured, I'll throw in a little bonus here. So at this point, I think I'm going to say that we're officially done for real this time. So hopefully you've enjoyed it if you managed to follow along this far. You have earned yourself a huge congratulations for putting up with, what is it, probably 20 hours of video almost. Took longer than I expected to make this series, took longer than I expected to make the game and to edit the videos. I'm still not done editing. It's halfway through, and it's taking longer than expected, but it has been enjoyable. And hopefully someone out there has enjoyed this, shown that I am somewhat competent with Unreal. Not necessarily an expert, but I definitely want to improve. This was one way that I wanted to improve, was make this series. And if I have to explain my reasoning for why I'm doing things out loud, it can help me realize that some things are a bad idea, and some things I have to justify to myself why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it, which helps me find a better way sometimes. So that's cool. So hopefully this was enjoyable, and I'd like to make more content like this in the future, but there's probably not much of an audience for it, but we'll see how this does. If anything, if I get more than 2 views, more than 5 views, it'll be pretty exciting, but we'll see. Hopefully now you feel more comfortable with Unreal, ready to make your own projects and improve upon what I've done here, and make your own puzzle games and make games in other genres. You can use blueprints to do a whole mess of other genres, and it's pretty fun to just work your way through the logic and figure out how to do stuff in Unreal. So hopefully now you are more familiar with the engine and more ready to set out and do your own thing. So how exciting. Well, thank you for watching if you stuck through this far, and hopefully I'll have more videos in the future.